So good evening, everyone, and thank you for your practice. And I'm curious, is anybody feeling, even though we're whatever day we are in the retreat, is there anybody feeling a little bit tired? Yeah. You know, I think I made the connection this time because, Bob and I had traveled, so we had a little jet lag. But I was thinking that sometimes on retreat there's a little jet lag that can happen because we're shifting in almost different time zones in a way, or different realities. And so it's normal to have some of that. I think there's a little jet lag as we kind of adjust almost to a quieter, slower pace. It takes time to turn the revving engines down a little bit, and when we do, we sometimes can feel a sense of tiredness that we didn't have the luxury of feeling before because we were moving full steam ahead. So I just wanted to acknowledge that. So this evening, I want to speak a little bit about the Four Noble Truths, or the four insights or realizations that the Buddha had in his awakening. The truth of suffering, the causes of suffering, that there can be a lessening or an end to the suffering, and a path to help lead to that lessening of suffering. And I'm not a Buddhist scholar, and nor do I feel like an expert at all with this, but these truths or insights, they live inside of me. There's something that I chew on and reflect on, and I feel like I keep learning about them. And so they keep kind of coming back and teaching me. So it's an ongoing process of deepening and understanding. And I was talking with Bob a little bit ago and was saying, I feel like in some way throughout this whole retreat, we've been talking about these insights or realizations the Buddha had in lots of different ways. And he said, oh yes, we could spend a week, a month, a year on each of the Noble Truths and just scratch the surface. So we're scratching the surface together tonight. And in many ways, these four insights or realizations the Buddha have, they kind of contain the entire foundation of his teachings, that his teachings unfolded from this. So it's almost like an umbrella or a container, a foundation on which all of the other teachings come from. So my attempt this evening is to just honor the depth and the vastness of these teachings just by scratching the surface a little bit. Yeah. And the Four Noble Truths we've been looking at this week, the four foundations of mindfulness, and they can be found in the fourth foundation of mindfulness, the mindfulness of the dhammas, or kind of a collection of wisdom teachings. It's where the teachings of the hindrances come from, the factors of awakening. And they're found in the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta. It's so hard for me to say that. Bob, it can just roll off his tongue, and I have to do it phonetically to get it. but it means the turning of the wheel of the Dhamma, the setting it in motion. So again, the foundationalness of the setting the wheel of the Dhamma in motion, the turning of the wheel. And when Siddhartha left the palace, he engaged in an intensive practice and investigation. And then he awoken as the Buddha. And he had a deep realization and understanding of suffering and its causes and the path to liberation. This was his awakening, his realization, or at least one of them. And his first sermon or discourse after his enlightenment was on these Four Noble Truths. And he said that I teach suffering, its origin, its cessation, and path. That's all I teach. So I feel better what we've been talking about all week. We've been under this umbrella or this container of these noble truths. And I know some people don't like the term noble. It can feel formal or have a little rigidness in it. But I like it. There's something about it for me that it feels like these truths or realizations are noble because they contain something essential. Something that is so true, so pure, and it's elemental, it's foundational, and it's a truth that it's hard to distill further down to something more essential, something that's underneath this truth. This is the foundation. So there's something noble about that. There's a regalness, a holiness, a sublimeness to these. And there's something I find really beautiful because they're very simple. And in their simplicity is a certain kind of elegance. They're so simple, but we can't be fooled by the simplicity. There's an elegance, something very pure and essential in there. And these insights, they're both complete in and of themselves, yet they're ever reaching and expanding. It's like they keep going out. Sometimes the Buddha has been compared to a physician, and a physician first kind of diagnoses the problem, suffering, and then of course is looking for the causes, the symptoms of the problem, which is ignorance and craving. And the third realization is that there's a cure. So diagnosing the problem, its causes. Oh, this can be cured. And there's a path for this. There's a prescription for this suffering. There's a way that can lessen the suffering and lead us out of it. And so the heart of the Buddha's teaching over 45 years or more is based on insight, wisdom, and compassion for all living beings. And as we begin to investigate these Four Noble Truths, we can find that insight, wisdom, and compassion fully woven in. So the first noble truth, the truth of suffering. In Pali, the language of the Buddha that Bob spoke about, there's a word called dukkha. I love saying that, dukkha. There's something wonderful about dukkha. It conveys something. But it translates to a kind of unsatisfactoriness. It's like just not able to be satisfied. And it's often translated as suffering, but there's just something not satisfactory. And I think we know this, like it's that experience of something's not quite right. There's an unease, there may be a disappointment, there may be frustration, there's stress. And I think we could come up with hundreds of words related to dukkha that would fall under that. There's many, many expressions of it. But essentially, we're not liking the way things are, and we want things to be different. It's that basic unsatisfactory. I don't like this reality. I want it to be different. There's unsatisfaction with the way things are. And so when we're not kind of accepting reality or in alignment with it, being aligned with the way things are, it is kind of this, it's just not satisfying. It just doesn't feel quite right. Bob and I had a friend named Barbara Roberts. I guess she's still our friend, but she died. And I remember once she was staying at our house, and I was going through some period of distress, feeling lost and confused. And she said to me, "You're only lost if you think there's somewhere else you're supposed to be." And it gave me such permission to be where I was, because I was looking for something else. I didn't like what was going on inside of me, right? And it was such a beautiful way to support me in being right where I was. It was very, very kind of her. And we all know this kind of unease that can creep in, and we may even have more of a sense of it because we've begun to, at least during this week, we've been paying attention to those feeling tones where that little bit of kind of comes in, and that sometimes can fuel those seeds of dissatisfaction. So we all know that sense of unease. And I think we all know or have had the experience that when we meet a truth, even if it's very difficult or painful, if we meet it, there's some way that our hearts get pierced and they open up. And even though it's very difficult, very painful maybe to be with this truth, there's something about meeting it that pierces our heart, opens it up, and it may be painful, but it feels right to be with it. There's almost a feeling, I don't even know what the word is, but there's a rightness to it because we're meeting things the way that they are. And of course, there's physical and emotional pain that, we're not going to dismiss and just say, dukkha. That's dukkha. No, those are very real. Our bodies can hurt. Our hearts can hurt. But the suffering comes by what we add to it, the story we create around it, how we respond to it, how we react to it. It's kind of that second arrow. The first arrow pierces us and injures us, but the second arrow is the one that we shoot ourselves and causes suffering. And I think for those of you who are MBSR or MBCT or teaching other mindfulness-based interventions, we know that the people who come to our classes are often suffering with sleeplessness, anxiety, all kinds of stresses, loss. There's real suffering in the room. And so part of the awareness that's cultivated in these classes is helping people to find some freedom from that suffering. And we talked about some of this this morning. Even though when we're experiencing pain or feeling suffering, we experience it in a very personal way. And it's part of our shared humanity. Everybody, everywhere, suffers. It's both personal and impersonal, like that's true, like it can be both. Personal and impersonal. And I just want to say, I think it's important and worth mentioning that the notion of dukkha or suffering, it's not intended to convey a negative worldview. You know, some people say, oh, Buddhism is just about suffering. No, it's not just about that. It's not intended to convey a negative worldview, but an honest perspective that deals with the world as it is, and how can we come to terms with the way things are. That's what this path is inviting us. So I find it really interesting that the Buddha didn't say, I suffer, I have suffering. Instead, he said, there is suffering. There's suffering, not I. So I'm curious about, the what, why, and who of it. Like, what is the suffering? Why are we suffering it? And who is suffering? Who is it? Or is it just that there is suffering? Personal and impersonal. So this kind of leads to the second realization, the realization of the causes of suffering. And in the second noble truth, the Buddha identified the causes of suffering as ignorance and craving. And ignorance, unawareness, is the seed that gives rise to craving. It's like the root. It's what's underneath and fueling the craving, because we don't know. And this ignorance implies an unawareness, a kind of blindness or thickness or obstruction, some way that we're incapable of seeing what's true, some way where we just can't comprehend reality. And part of our work of investigation is to begin to remove the veils before our eyes, to begin to investigate and remove whatever obstructions that are in the way from us seeing clearly. We suffer in many ways because of our mistaken belief that we're a separate, independent I. And Bob spent a fair amount of time last night talking about this notion of self and no self and what is the self. And I think there's an ignorance or a forgetting, that, what is that Wordsworth, our birth is but a sleep and a forgetting. There's a forgetting that our essential nature is free because it's been covered up by our conditioning, by all these causes and conditioning. So we lost touch with our essential nature that's not separate but interconnected with all of life. We're not bounded just by our skin. We live in these bodies, but we're much more than that. This is just a part of us, an expression of us, a vehicle in which we can awaken. So sometimes we're living with a case of mistaken identity. And it makes me wonder, who is it that suffers? And there's, again, is that very personal? Like, I know suffering intimately. I know it. But who suffers? Does awareness suffer? Is awareness in pain? I think these are important questions to chew on, to ponder, to investigate. I loved Bob's question last night of, where is the self to be found? It's an important question. This is a quote from Sir Isaac Newton. He said, "I don't know what I may appear to the world, but to myself I seem to have been only like a boy playing on the seashore, diverting myself now and then, finding a smoother pebble or a prettier shell than ordinary, while the great ocean of truth lay all undiscovered before me." This great ocean of truth is all here. Oh, I shouldn't have drank water. I got in my throat. So, that was a mistake to drink water. So, ignorance, like I said before, it leads to craving. So, craving, the original Pali word for craving is tanha. And it's the root. It means like to thirst. Tanha, to thirst. And we all know what it's like to be really thirsty, like to be dry, to be thirsty. And so this craving is like a thirst. And I don't honestly know if this is part of the Buddha's teachings or not, so bear with me because I don't want to misrepresent in any way. So that's my disclaimer in small print. But I think there's a true thirst that lives in us. A true thirst to know, what is this life? What is this reality? Because when we're separate from it, we want to know it. There's, of course, a thirst for that. A thirst to be free from suffering. But because of our ignorance, we tend to look in all the wrong places for it. And we try to hold on to something, try to find permanence somewhere. And there's this insatiable quality to craving. It's like, I think we just know, like there's never enough. We need more. This wanting, this grasping, this searching, this endless seeking. This endless seeking to find the answers. So we suffer. One of the reasons is because we crave permanence. This is a quote from Thich Nhat Hanh. He said, "It's not because of impermanence that we suffer, but because of our ideas about permanence." So it's not because of impermanence, but our ideas about permanence. So this longing for truth, or for being with the true nature of reality, comes from the place of truth itself. But because, again, of our mistaken identity, we feel like it's outside of ourselves. It's out there. You have it. It's over there. This teaching has it. That retreat has it. This bowl of ice cream has it. So we crave. And the Buddha talked specifically about 3 areas of craving: the craving of the senses, the craving to be someone, and the craving to feel nothing. And it's not that sensual desire is wrong. It's really a natural part of our evolutionary biology, the desire for warmth, to be fed, to be cared for. But no matter how delicious a meal is, it doesn't provide long-term satisfaction and happiness. Eventually, we want more, something different, something else. And of course, on retreat, we get to experience that a lot. Like, how many have had food cravings here on retreat? Maybe wanting something a little bit different, or some little treat. And again, that's not that that's wrong or bad, but if we're basing our well-being and happiness and freedom on getting that bar of chocolate, we're going to be in trouble. Yeah, so sometimes we base our well-being on the fulfillment of these sensual desires. Like, if I don't have a cup of coffee or a cup of tea first thing in the morning, my day is ruined, right? It's like, I can't cope. Forget it. You know, if someone uses all the hot water and I go to take a shower, I'm going to blame somebody. Like, this isn't okay. There should be hot water for me. And, you know, if our internet breaks or something happens with my computer, I blame Bob. And Bob always tells me, restart your computer. So, like, this is what's here, this craving. Like, I lost the internet for 2 seconds. I can't stand it. I need it. Right? Remember when we went from dial-up and it's just got to be, yeah. So this is what addiction is based on, this craving for something outside of us to bring fulfillment. Some of you here in the mindfulness, working with mindfulness, may be familiar with Judd Brown's work. He's at Brown University. He had been at CFM and is now at Brown. And he's doing a lot of research on addiction right now. And he's really taking an approach to encourage people to really understand their addiction instead of turning away from it, like to really feel like if I have this cigarette, notice the urgings for it and what it's like. What do I feel when I'm having it? What do I feel after it? And like this understanding that's coming is helping people to become free of their addictions and become aware of what's fueling it. I think it's very exciting work that he's doing. I think it's really important. I think there's a good TED Talk or something or YouTube with that. And the craving to be someone, Bob, of course, spoke about this last night. And often we just see ourselves as separate. That our identity is in this body here instead of the larger fabric of which we're part of. We have a smaller sense of identity. And this craving to be somebody, like we all want to be seen, to be loved, to be recognized. And I think biologically speaking, an infant needs the mother or someone there in order to survive. And then we develop this looking outside ourselves for that satisfaction. And we don't learn that it's right here. It's right inside of us. And if we don't learn how to see and cherish and care for ourselves, there's no amount of success or fame or glory or someone else seeing us that will fill that. If we don't see ourselves, it doesn't matter if there's 100 people saying, oh, you're great. It doesn't matter. Because the core identity maybe isn't one of value or worth or seeing oneself. And of course, an exaggeration of this is Donald Trump. I mean, it's so sad, bless his heart. He so desperately wants to be seen, to be the best, to be the greatest, to be the most fabulous. And he portrays this grandiose sense of self-importance, exaggerating his achievements and his skills. I don't need to go on about it. But I think it's covering up a core sense of deficiency. And I know the psychologist and the psychiatrist in the room could say a lot more about this, but he'll do almost anything for attention. And because he doesn't have it inside of himself, there's this constant grabbing. I'm bigger, I'm better than you. It's heartbreaking. And he's not the only one with that. Of course, we all have in some way our own sense of narcissism, which can also get in the way of our seeing reality. I think we don't see our wholeness. We don't see our value. And there may be a belief that who we are somehow needs to be different, that there needs to be a better, more improved version of ourselves. And my mom, who is just the dearest person in the world, I mean, just such a kind and beautiful heart, she didn't know that about herself. And she often would say, if only I were different. What a painful thing to say. And, there was a sense of deficiency and some way, like if only I were different. And very, very painful, to not see who she really was, which was a very dear and kind person. And this craving to feel nothing, it's hard to be with our suffering. Of course we want to push it away, we want to avoid it, we want to get rid of it, we don't want to feel it. But this leads to more disconnection. It's that second arrow again. It actually adds more suffering. And sometimes this craving to feel nothing can come from a sense of feeling overwhelmed with the relentlessness of life. Life can be relentless sometimes. And so, learning to care from ourselves without disconnecting from ourselves. Learning to be present to ourselves without going away from ourselves. And this, when we go away, there's a dullness that can happen, a lethargy, that kind of sloth and torpor that Bob talked about. And of course, all of these cravings lead to a sense of suffering. But we're getting to the good part, the third noble truth. I love the third noble truth, and often, people don't talk about it so much, but it's really the promise or the hope that there's an end to suffering. It points to the possibility of liberation. It's the third noble truth is why we're all here, because of the possibility of liberation, of lessening ignorance and craving, and thus the lessening of suffering. It's so hopeful. And somehow we know there's a way because we've tasted it, we've had glimpses of it. And perhaps there's been times we've had a sense of peace or harmony or an insight that just opened something larger up for us. And the dispelling of this ignorance and craving begins to quench that thirst. It begins to release us from that cycle of suffering. And we come to see that our suffering is a result of the way we are, how we hold things. It's not because of the way the world is. So our suffering's not because of the way the world is, it's more how we relate to it, how we hold it, how we are inside with this. And when we begin to see this and to know this and to recognize this, it helps us to disidentify with our limited sense of self and to feel our larger connection with this wanting to live in harmony. So when we feel our larger connection that we're part of, we know that we're interconnected and interrelated to all. So this leads us to this fourth noble truth or realization of the Buddha, this path as a way to relieve suffering. And it's both a prescription and an expression of freedom. So the Buddha outlined this eightfold path for living wisely to lessen our suffering. And the basis of it, because he really understood suffering. He really understood its causes. So the basis of this eightfold path is compassion. Compassion for all beings. And again, it's both a prescription, like he both taught the eightfold path, like wise speech, wise action, wise intention, as ways to live our life. But I think it's also an expression of that naturally comes when we feel this deeper connection with all of life, when we understand suffering and the causes of suffering, then we want to live in harmony and truth. We want to express ourselves as part of this connection. We want to care for ourselves and others. So the Eightfold Path is grouped into three different kind of essential elements of Buddhist practice. There's the ethical conduct, or sila, mental discipline to help settle and calm the mind, samadhi, and wisdom, pana. So I'll say a little bit about some these eightfold steps in the path. And I want to say that these aren't ordered. They're interrelated and interconnected. And that when we engage with this path, that each step supports the other and helps the other to blossom and to grow and to bloom. So this ethical conduct, this kind of heading of ethical conduct, it really points the way to a virtuous life, to not cause harm or suffering, but to live with integrity. And of course, we find this in the precepts that we took at the beginning of the retreat. When we hold an awareness of suffering, this wish arises to not add to it. So part of the Eightfold Path is wise speech, and speaking in a way that cultivates clarity and causes no harm. And I think wise speech is such an important part of the Eightfold Path, because many of us have been harmed by speech that wasn't kind, wasn't skillful, maybe wasn't timely, wasn't honest. And it hurts. It causes pain. Sylvia Borenstein, talking about wise speech, she puts it really simply, and she says, make blessing a habit. And I love that for wise speech. Make blessing a habit. There's a Sufi proverb that talks about the three gatekeepers of the tongue. And is it true? Is it kind? Is it necessary? Maybe true, but maybe it's not necessary. Is it kind? When our sons were little, we were, they were quite young, at least Ben was, and we were in some parent support group with the most wise woman, Janice Kaiser, and one of the parents in the group was asking her a question and I don't remember the exact question, but it was something like, how do I talk with my child, with my son, about this person who's kind of mean and rude and not very nice? Like, what do I do with that? How do I talk with them? And what Janice said is, oh, he hasn't learned how to be kind yet. And I love that. She saw his wholeness, like, oh, this is just an expression of his suffering, this harshness, this criticism, this rudeness, this rough and gruffness. It's an expression of his suffering. He hasn't learned how to speak kindly yet. I think that's so beautiful. And the Buddha said that better than 1,000 hollow words is one word that brings peace. Better than 1,000 hollow words, one word that brings peace. Another part of the Eightfold Path is wise action. This acting in a way that causes no harm to yourself, to others, that's honest. And again, here we can remember those precepts of not killing, not stealing, not engaging in sexual misconduct. This wise action creates a sense of safety and goodwill. It's a way we can extend this wise action. And all of us are being called right now to protect and care for our planet. That's wise action. By, conserving our resources, not littering, polluting. So it's something we're all called to do. And when we feel this connection with something larger, this is an expression. Wise action is an expression. The Buddha also on the path talked about wise livelihood, supporting oneself in a wholesome way, causing no harm, having integrity at work, doing your best, respecting yourself and others. And some of us have the freedom to work in environments or systems or places where this is maybe easier to practice, and some of us may be working in environments where there may not be a consciousness or an awareness, but we can still practice this wise livelihood to do our best, to make a difference, to make change. The other kind of umbrella, so there's this ethical conduct, and then the Buddha talked about how to cultivate mental discipline. And of course, we've been cultivating that here as well this week. This wise effort to cultivate skillful and peaceful habits of mind, learning how to use our minds wisely, to discern wisely, to become aware when we're getting caught, and really committing to the practice of being steadfast, showing up. Or as Frank Ostaseski said, bring your whole self to the experience, like really showing up, wise effort. I love this quote from Nelson Mandela. For to be free is not merely to cast off one's chains, but to live in a way that respects and enhances the freedom of others. So to live in a way that enhances the freedom of others. Wise mindfulness, cultivating this alertness, this awareness, this balanced attention, and bringing mindfulness into all of our activities, which we've been practicing this week. And with the mindfulness-based interventions, people are both practicing formally, but more importantly, or maybe not more, but just as importantly, informally. Bringing mindfulness into sweeping the floor, washing the dishes, walking the dog. And this wise concentration, cultivating that steadiness, that focus, really bringing our attention, really bringing a focus. When the mind wanders, bringing it back. That wise concentration. And the last two steps on this eightfold path are the cultivation of wisdom, or panya, wise understanding, realizing the causes of suffering and cultivating compassion and wisdom. And wise intention, being intentional about why you practice. Being intentional to not cause harm. Being intentional about expressing compassion. So this eightfold path, all these steps are just so interwoven, and you can see how wise speech supports wise action and right livelihood and wise effort. The wise use of our mind and our effort and our intention, that they're so overlapping and interlapping and interpenetrating that this is not only the prescription, but also the expression of freedom. So by living ethically and practicing mindfully and developing wisdom, and mindfulness really helps to develop insight, wisdom, and compassion. This wisdom and compassion are the two wings. So by developing this wisdom, we can, in some ways, follow the steps of the Buddha on his journey of awakening. This living wisely, with integrity, this cultivating of awareness, this cultivating of compassion, of wisdom, that we can begin to take those steps on the path, and that we too can wake up. And our practice is not separate from our realization. They go together. And the path to freedom can be cultivated by understanding the fact of suffering, its causes, and that there can be a lessening of suffering, and that this path can help lead us to more freedom and more compassion for all beings. So I want to end, this is from the Buddha under the heading of Regarding Nibbana, Nibbana, and it's from Udana 8.1. There is bhikkhus, or monks, holy ones. There is bhikkhus a base where there is no earth, no water, no fire, no air, no base consisting of the infinity of space, no base consisting of the infinity of consciousness, no base consisting of nothingness, no base consisting of neither perception nor non-perception, neither this world nor another world nor both, neither sun nor moon. Hear, bhikkhus, I say there is no coming, no going, no staying, no deceasing, no uprising, not fixed, not movable. It has no support. This is the end of suffering. So let's sit for a few moments. So you're welcome to remain sitting in the hall or enjoying a walking practice.